Wither in that cell, mother, while we burn through every dime of your legacy. My son Caleb's voice reverberated through the tribunal as the bailiff clicked the steel cuffs around my wrists. The iron was freezing, so icy it felt like it scorched my skin. But that physical sensation was nothing compared to the tearing agony in my chest as I watched my own flesh and blood laughing at me, cheering my conviction as if it were the greatest victory of his life. Serafina was clung to his bicep, displaying that triumphant smirk she had honed over the past few months. She leaned in tight and murmured something into his ear. Caleb erupted into laughter again, louder now, ensuring I could hear him from where I stood, bound like a common thief. The magistrate struck his mallet, calling for order, but it didn't matter any longer. The verdict had been delivered. 3 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud and asset misappropriation. Felonies I never committed, crimes they had engineered with forged ledgers, purchased testimonies, and an act so persuasive even the court had swallowed it whole. Caleb and Serafina rose from their bench. He draped his arm over her shoulders, and together they marched toward the exit with the swagger of conquerors who have just won a war. Serafina glanced back one final time to lock eyes with me, and what I witnessed in her gaze froze my marrow. It wasn't merely satisfaction, it was absolute disdain. To her, I was nothing more than a hurdle that had finally been shoved off the road. They walked out to toast their triumph. I watched them pass through the mahogany doors, hand in hand, chuckling. They were likely already scheming how to drain my accounts. An extravagant dinner at a prime steakhouse, vintage wine, perhaps a getaway to the French Riviera. My empire, built over decades of grit and sacrifice, was now in the clutches of 2 people who hadn't worked an honest day in their existence. The deputy tugged my elbow, compelling me to rise. My knees objected. At 70 years of age, every abrupt motion is a torment, but I willed myself to hold my posture. I wouldn't grant them the joy of watching me collapse, not here. Not in front of these strangers who had already condemned me without knowing the reality. As I was hauled toward the side exit of the tribunal, I heard the whispers of the gallery. Some viewed me with sympathy, others with revulsion. An acquaintance who had been close with my late husband averted her gaze when our eyes crossed. The humiliation was almost heavier than the shackles. The corridor to the processing unit smelled of industrial bleach and hopelessness. My heels clicked against the scuffed linoleum as the guards silently steered me. Other condemned souls walked in the opposing direction, some weeping, others with vacant stares, all sharing that identical look of total ruin. But I wasn't ruined, not yet. We arrived at a small, windowless holding area with chipping beige walls and polymer chairs bolted to the concrete. An elderly corrections officer sat behind a steel desk, scanning paperwork with the lethargy of someone who has performed the same task for eras. He glanced up when we stepped in. Officer Salas Vance read the badge on his uniform. His face was weathered, etched with deep lines that told of a rugged life. His eyes were weary, yet not malicious. There was a gentleness in them that clashed with the harsh environment. His uniform was pristine, meticulously ironed, as if that small show of dignity was the only thing anchoring his sanity in this cage. The escorting deputy exchanged a few murmurs with Silas, handed him a dossier with my records, and then departed. The heavy door shut with a final thud that echoed in my skull. I was left solitary with the old officer. Silas opened the file and began to assess the documents in silence. I sank onto one of the plastic seats, feeling every single one of my 70 years in my bones. The cuffs remained on my wrists. The metal was now tepid from the heat of my skin. I stared at the floor, attempting to digest everything that had just transpired. My own son had dispatched me to prison. My own boy, the infant I had rocked in my arms through endless nights of colic. The child I had reared alone after his father perished from a stroke when Caleb was only 12. The man I had trusted blindly because he was my lineage, my soul kin. and now he and his wife were outside rejoicing, certain they had won, certain I was finished. A defenseless senior citizen who had spent her twilight years locked behind bars while they savored every dollar I had accumulated. But they were ignorant of one thing, something vital, something that would alter the entire game. Silas was still focused on the paperwork, occasionally grimacing, flipping pages, jotting notes in a tattered spiral pad. I seized that moment of inattention carefully, with the stealth that only comes from years of being overlooked by the world. I slid my right hand toward the inner lining of my tweed blazer. I had worn this jacket since the arraignment began. It was vintage, a dull charcoal with slightly frayed cuffs. Nothing ostentatious, but it possessed deep, concealed pockets, and in one of those pockets, folded into a precise tiny square, was the paper I had drafted the night prior in my holding cell, the note, my final lifeline. My fingers quivered as I slowly extracted it, inch by inch, ensuring I made no sound that would snag Silas's attention. The paper was warm from my body, slightly damp with anxious perspiration. I gripped it between my digits, feeling its negligible weight that was simultaneously monumental. On that scrap of paper, torn from a budget notepad, was scribbled a name, a contact number, and a vow that would shift the earth. Silas closed the dossier and leaned back in his chair, which groaned under his mass. He exhaled with the fatigue of a man who has watched too many shattered destinies cross that desk. He looked at me with something that might have been pity, or perhaps just the automatic reflex of a decent soul trapped in an indecent machine. Transport will arrive in roughly 20 minutes, Mrs. Thorne. Do you require the facilities? Water, his tone was gentle. That startled me. I hadn't anticipated benevolence on a day like this, not after the hell that had unfolded. Water, please, I whispered. My voice emerged fractured. I hadn't consumed a drop for hours. Silas nodded and slowly hoisted himself from the chair. His knees popped as he rose, a noise I recognized because my own joints sang the same song every dawn. He was an aging man, likely a year or two from a pension, carrying that burden on his shoulders that comes from decades in a trade nobody thanks you for and nobody desires. He walked toward a small utility table in the corner where a plastic pitcher and stacked paper cups sat. His back was turned. That was my window, the only one I would get. With a motion I had mentally practiced 100 times, I slid the folded note onto his desk, directly beside the file containing my sentencing papers. I positioned it so it appeared to be part of the official stack, yet conspicuous enough for him to spot upon his return. My heart was thumping so violently I was certain Silas could hear the rhythm from where he stood. My pulse hammered in my ears like tribal drums. The escort was gone. Caleb and Serafina were outside toasting. And Silas still had his back to me, filling a cup with water that shook slightly from the tremor in his own weary hands. He returned with the cup and extended it to me. I accepted the vessel with my shackled hands, the chains clinking softly, grateful to have a task for them, something to mask the shaking I couldn't suppress. I sipped slowly, even though every cell in my anatomy screamed to gulp it down in one draught. The water was tepid with that chemical tang cheap cups impart, but it was the most divine nectar I had tasted in days. Silas sat down again, and his gaze immediately locked onto the note. I witnessed the precise second he registered it. His eyes narrowed, perplexed. He remained motionless for a heartbeat, staring at the paper as if it had materialized by sorcery. Then, cautiously, as if it might detonate, he pinched it between his fingers. I continued to sip the water, feigning ignorance, but tracking him through my peripheral vision. Every muscle in my frame was rigid. Everything hinged on this instant, on how he reacted, whether he believed me or deemed me a desperate old woman spinning delusions. Silas slowly unfolded the note. His hands were broad, coarse, with scars and calluses that told of a youth spent in labor. I read every micro-expression on his visage as his eyes scanned the words I had penned with a shaking hand the night before. I saw his brows lift. I saw his lips part slightly, forming a small O of astonishment. I saw the exact moment confusion morphed into absolute shock. The note read, "My son does not know who my new husband is. Call Magnus Blackwood at this number. Tell him his wife has been seized. In exchange for this aid, you will receive a home and a new destiny for your kin." Beneath it was a telephone number inked in black, each digit carefully drawn so it was perfectly legible. Silas looked up at me. His eyes, previously fatigued and resigned, were now entirely alert. There were questions in them, hundreds of inquiries, but above all there was disbelief. "Magnus Blackwood," he whispered, his voice quavering slightly. "The Magnus Blackwood," I nodded once, slowly, holding his stare without blinking. I needed him to see the veracity in my eyes, to comprehend that this wasn't a jest, that it wasn't the hallucination of a frantic convict seeking an impossible salvation. Silas's face visibly paled. He knew that name. Of course he did. Everyone in this region knew that name. Magnus Blackwood wasn't merely a successful tycoon. He was a living institution. Construction, luxury real estate, urban infrastructure, investments that shifted millions daily, political ties that stretched all the way to the capital, a man whose surname unlocked gates that, for the rest of mortals, remained bolted and welded shut. And that man, that titan of industry who graced the covers of business journals, was my spouse. Silas looked at the note again, then at me, then back at the paper. His hands shook slightly as he held that small scrap containing intelligence that could alter his existence as drastically as mine. I saw his throat bob as he swallowed. I saw his eyes glisten with something that wasn't exactly tears, but the weight of too many crushed dreams over too many years. "Ma'am," he finally murmured, his voice barely a breath. "If this is valid, it is valid," I interrupted softly, every syllable. He folded the note meticulously, almost reverently, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Then he just sat there processing, trying to fathom how it was possible that Magnus Blackwood's wife was sitting before him, handcuffed, damned to 3 years in prison by her own offspring. And I knew I needed to tell him something. Not the whole saga, there wasn't time, but enough for him to grasp the context. For him to know that this wasn't just about wealth or retribution. It was about vindication. It was about the truth. "How did you end up here?" Silas asked, and there was genuine sorrow in his tone. "How could he not know? How could he not shield you?" I closed my eyes for a second, letting the memories rush in. I had met Magnus 6 months ago, 6 months that had been the most radiant of my life after years of absolute gray. My first husband, Caleb's father, had passed 15 years ago. A sudden coronary that left me a widow at 55 with a grown son who barely visited, and a mansion too vast, filled with echoes. For all those years, I had resigned myself to solitude. I had accepted that this was my narrative now, tending my orchids, reading novels, watching television until I drifted off on the sofa. Occasionally, Caleb dropped by, always in a hurry, always with apologies about business, about how swamped he was. And then Serafina arrived, and the visits became even rarer. But 6 months ago, the script flipped. I had gone to a gallery opening downtown. A friend had dragged me, insisting I needed to circulate, socialize, live a little. And there, standing before a painting of violets that reminded me of the garden my mother kept when I was a girl, I saw him, Magnus Blackwood. At first, I didn't recognize who he was. I just saw a distinguished man with perfectly silvered hair and an impeccable suit, gazing at the same canvas with an expression of wistfulness that I recognized because it mirrored my own. The wistfulness of someone who has lost something precious and seeks to locate it in the most unlikely corners. We spoke first about the brushwork, then about art in general, then about our journeys. I discovered he was also a widower. His wife had succumbed to illness 3 years prior. He told me he visited that gallery every month because it was where he had taken her on their first outing. I told him about my greenhouse, about how the blooms were the only thing keeping me grounded after so many barren years. We met again the following week, and then again and again. Coffees turned into dinners. Dinners turned into strolls through the botanical gardens. And before I knew it, I had fallen in love like a schoolgirl, feeling tremors in my stomach every time my phone chimed. And it was him. Magnus was completely transparent with me from the start. He told me who he was, what he commanded, how much wealth he possessed, but he requested something in return: absolute discretion. He explained that there were rivals who detested him, ruthless competitors who wouldn't hesitate to leverage any personal data against him. He told me about threats he had fielded in the past, extortion attempts, scenarios where the people he cherished became targets simply for being in his orbit. And he asked me to keep our union a secret, at least for a spell, until he could guarantee I would be insulated, until he could organize the necessary security detail, until everything was aligned. I agreed without hesitation because, after so many desolate years, after so much silence, Magnus had returned something I thought was extinguished forever: the capacity to feel, to laugh, to wake up every morning with a reason to smile. We married in a private ceremony at his chateau beyond the city limits. Just the two of us, a magistrate and two witnesses Magnus had known for decades and trusted implicitly. It was simple, intimate, flawless. We exchanged modest bands that we wore concealed beneath our garments or on chains. He kissed my brow and promised me that soon we could live openly, that soon we wouldn't have to hide. But I made a blunder, a miscalculation I now understood had been catastrophic. I didn't tell Caleb anything. I thought it would be fleeting. I thought that in a few weeks, perhaps a month, Magnus would finish arranging the logistics, and then I could introduce him to my son. I could tell him that his mother had found romance again, that I was no longer solitary, that someone was caring for me and bringing me joy. But before I could do that, the floor collapsed. It started 3 months ago. Caleb appeared at my door unannounced, which was irregular because he typically called ahead. Serafina was with him as always, attached to his flank like a parasite. They entered with a strange, jittery energy. Caleb scanned the room as if he were appraising it. Serafina touched the heirlooms with her manicured claws, making remarks about how dated everything was, about how I should modernize, renovate, liquidate some assets to make the estate more current. They inquired about my liquidity. They wanted to know how much capital I had stored, what the estate was appraised at if I held stocks, bonds, additional deeds. I told them I was secure, that I had ample funds to live comfortably, not to worry about me. But I didn't provide specifics. Something about the way they probed made my skin crawl, an avarice I didn't comprehend. There was a hunger in their eyes that I detested, a desperation I couldn't place. Caleb pressed. He claimed he was in financial straits, that his firm was hitting a rough patch, that he needed a bridge loan. Just temporary, he swore, just until the market corrected. Maybe 50,000, maybe a bit more. I told him I didn't have that sum immediately accessible, which was factual. Most of my wealth was tied up in long-term trusts, funds I couldn't tap without massive penalties. But I offered to aid him with 10,000, everything in my checking account. Serafina's expression curdled. I saw the fury flash in her eyes before she could mask it. Caleb looked defeated, frustrated, but he took the 10,000 and vowed to repay it in 90 days. He never did, and a week later they returned, this time with more urgency. They needed more, 20,000. It was a crisis. An investment window they couldn't miss. They begged me. Caleb took my hands and looked at me with those eyes I had known since he was a toddler, and I, heaven help me, caved again. I liquidated a bond, paying the fee, and gave it to him. That money didn't return either. And then the frequent visits commenced, always demanding more, always with fresh pretexts, new disasters. And I started saying no because I was beginning to grasp that something was wrong, that this wasn't normal, that they were bleeding me dry. That is when the tactic shifted. Caleb arrived one day with binders, contracts, papers saturated with legal jargon I didn't fully parse. He told me he needed me to autograph them, that it was merely a formality, a restructuring of family assets to shield me from estate taxes, from legal tangles should anything happen to me. I told him I wanted my attorney to review them first, and that is when I saw something in my son's eyes that I had never witnessed before, something obscure, something perilous. "Don't you trust me, mother?" he asked. And there was venom in his tone. "I am your son, your only kin. Are you going to fail me because of your paranoia?" Serafina intervened with that saccharine voice she utilized when she aimed to manipulate. She spoke about how tough it had been for Caleb growing up fatherless, about how I was his bedrock, about how he only wanted to secure me, to ensure my twilight was guarded. And I, God help me, signed. I signed because he was my son. Because despite everything, despite the chasm that had widened between us, despite the fact that Serafina had warped him in ways I loathed, he was still my boy, the infant I had nursed, the child I had guided alone after his father died. I couldn't conceive he would destroy me, but I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I received the summons, a lawsuit. My own son was suing me for fraud, for embezzlement of family trusts, for forgery. The very documents I had signed out of faith were now being weaponized as evidence against me. Caleb had doctored everything. He had altered the pages after I signed them. He had fabricated a narrative where I had pilfered money from joint accounts we supposedly shared, where I had forged his signature on transfers, where I had acted as a villain who exploited her own son's naivety. I hired a lawyer, the best I could afford with my frozen assets, but Caleb had been meticulous. He had perjured witnesses, bank records that appeared legitimate, emails I supposedly drafted, even though I never typed them. It was a flawless frame-up, and the worst part was that Magnus knew nothing. He was overseas the entire time, managing a merger in Zurich. We spoke on the phone, but I didn't want to burden him with my domestic strife. I thought I could handle it solo. I thought the truth would surface and justice would prevail. How foolish I was. The trial was a nightmare. My lawyer fought, but the evidence fabricated against me was crushing. Caleb wept on the stand, playing the devastated son betrayed by his greedy mother. Serafina testified with crocodile tears sliding down her cheeks, speaking about how I had always been controlling with finances, about how I had threatened to disown Caleb if he didn't obey my whims. And the jury bought every word, guilty, 3 years incarceration. Magnus returned to the country the day before the sentencing, but by then the walls had closed in. I didn't have time to contact him, to explain, to plead for aid. I was swiftly shuffled from the courtroom to the processing bay, and now I was here reciting fragments of this horror to a corrections officer who held in his pocket the only spark I had left. "My son thinks he won," I told Silas. And my voice was steadier now, steelier. He and his wife believe they are going to seize all my assets, my estate, everything I built over the years, but they don't know Magnus exists. They don't know he's going to find out what they did. And when he does, I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. Silas understood. He took the note out of his pocket again and read it a third time as if he needed to verify the ink hadn't faded. "A house," he murmured. "You can really grant me a house." "Magnus can," I corrected him, "and he will. He is a man of honor. If you tell him I requested this, if you explain the predicament, he will reward you. He has properties all over the state. Residences he holds for portfolios. He can deed you one. He can give you more than that. He can rewrite your future." Silas closed his eyes. I saw a solitary tear track down his rugged cheek. When he opened them again, he had cemented a decision. "I have a daughter," he said softly. "Clara, she's 26 with 2 toddlers. My son-in-law abandoned them last winter, vanished without a trace. She lives with me and my wife in a 2-bedroom flat we can barely sustain. The kids sleep on the rug. My wife is ill. She needs specialty meds that our insurance denies. I work double shifts just to keep our noses above water." His voice cracked. "If you're telling me the truth, if there's even a sliver of a chance this is real, I'll make that call because my family needs a miracle as much as you do." I held his gaze. Call him. Silas retrieved his cell phone from his desk drawer. It was an obsolete model with a fractured screen and a case rubbed smooth by time. His hands shook as he punched in the digits I had scribbled. I saw him hesitate for a beat, his thumb hovering over the dial key as if the gravity of his action hit him with full force. But then he pressed it. The sound of the connection filled the cramped room. 1, 2, 3 rings. I held my breath. It had been 3 days since I last spoke to Magnus. 3 days that felt like an epic. He had called the night prior to the trial, but I was so distraught, so consumed by terror that I could barely string together a sentence. I told him everything was fine, that I was just fatigued, that I loved him and we would speak soon. I lied, and now I was paying the tariff for that lie. The 4th ring, the 5th. Silas looked at me with anxiety, as if he suspected no one would answer, that this was the cruel fantasy of a breaking mind. But then the line clicked. Blackwood. Magnus's voice was crisp, commanding. It was his boardroom tone, the one he wielded when he was closing deals or crushing opposition. Silas almost dropped the device. He cleared his throat, hunting for his voice. Mr. Blackwood, My name is Silas Vance. I'm a corrections officer at the Metro District Court. I'm calling because, he paused, looking at me for reassurance. I nodded, because your wife asked me to contact you. The silence on the other end of the line was total, so absolute that for a second I thought the call had severed, but then I heard Magnus's breathing accelerate, sharper, more intense. Victoria, his tone had totally shifted. He was no longer the icy tycoon. He was a terrified husband. What happened to Victoria? Mr. Vance, she was arrested, convicted. She is here with me now, awaiting transfer to the state penitentiary. She gave me this number and instructed me to call you. She claims you are her spouse. Arrested, the word erupted like a thunderclap. Why the hell did no one inform me? When did this occur? Where is she now? Silas passed the handset to me. My cuffed hands made it awkward to grip, but I managed. When I heard Magnus's voice, so familiar, so beloved, something inside me shattered. The tears I had been damming up for days, for weeks, finally breached the wall. Magnus, my voice was barely a choked sob. Magnus, I am so sorry. I should have told you everything from the start. Victoria, my love, what is transpiring? Speak slowly. Where are you? Who arrested you? Why? Caleb, I said, and my son's name tasted like bile. He accused me of fraud, forged records, lied under oath. They sentenced me to 3 years. Magnus, 3 years. Silence again, but this time it was distinct. It was the calm before the cyclone. When Magnus spoke again, his voice was dangerously tranquil, controlled, but I could hear the magma churning just beneath the crust. Your son did this. Your own son sent you to a cage. He and his wife, Serafina. They orchestrated everything. They wanted my fortune, my estate. They thought I was isolated, that no one would shield me. They don't know you exist, Magnus. They don't know a thing about us. Where exactly are you right now? At the Metro District Court Processing Division. They're going to transfer me in less than 15 minutes. They are not transferring you anywhere, Magnus stated. And his tone left no margin for debate. Put the officer back on the line. I handed the phone back to Silas. He took it with trembling hands and pressed it to his ear. Mr. Blackwood, Magnus's voice was so resonant I could hear it from my chair. Listen to me very closely. My wife is not boarding that transport. She is going to remain exactly where she is until I arrive with my legal battalion. Do you understand me, sir? I don't have the authority to halt a scheduled transfer. There are protocols. Procedures that, I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Vance, in less than 5 minutes. Judge Abernathy is going to receive an emergency call requesting a temporary suspension of the sentence based on gross procedural irregularities. In less than 10 minutes. You will have a signed injunction stopping any movement of prisoner Victoria Thorne until the case is reviewed. And if anything befalls my wife before I get there, if anyone moves her a single inch from that room, I will personally ensure that every individual involved in this travesty loses their career and faces ruin. Have I been clear enough? Silas had completely bleached. He nodded even though Magnus couldn't see him. Yes, sir, perfectly clear. Good, now put my wife back on. Silas returned the phone to me almost reverently. Magnus, I whispered. I didn't know what else to say. I'm so sorry for keeping you in the dark, for not involving you from the onset. Don't apologize. His voice softened. None of this is your fault. Do you hear me? None of it. But I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to get you out. And your son, that scoundrel who dares to call himself your blood, is going to pay for every second of suffering he inflicted. He's my son, Magnus. Despite everything, he's still my son. He ceased being your son the moment he decided to betray you like this. Magnus paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was charged with a dark vow. But don't worry about that now. Focus on staying safe. Don't talk to anyone. Don't sign anything. Don't accept anything they offer you. My team will be there in less than an hour. The best criminal defense attorney in the state, Alistair Sterling, is already en route. He will handle everything. And Silas, I asked, looking at the officer who had bridged this gap. I promised you would aid him. He has a family that needs support. Officer Vance is going to receive everything you promised him and more, Magnus declared. After I finish with all this, he and his kin will never have to worry about currency again. You have my word. Silas, who had been listening, closed his eyes, and an expression of absolute relief washed over his face. It was as if a decade-long anchor had been cut from his neck in a single instant. I love you, I told Magnus, feeling that the words were insufficient. Thank you for not abandoning me. I would never abandon you, he replied. We are a family now, Victoria, and family defends its own. Stay put, don't move. I'm coming, the call ended. I handed the phone back to Silas and we sat in silence, processing what had just occurred. The clock on the wall marked the passing of minutes with a tick-tock that seemed excruciatingly slow. Every second was a torture of anticipation. 7 minutes later, the landline on Silas's desk rang. He answered instantly. Vance, he said, and then his face transformed. Yes, Your Honor. Yes, understood. Immediately, he hung up and looked at me with a mixture of awe and shock. Judge Abernathy just issued a temporary stay of your transfer. You are to remain here until your counsel arrives. He was silent for a moment. Mrs. Thorne, I don't know who you really are, but your husband just moved mountains in less than 10 minutes. I smiled for the first time in days, in weeks, because finally, after all the agony, all the treachery, all the injustice, something was going right. Magnus was coming, and when Magnus Blackwood decided to rectify something, nothing and no one stood in his path. But while we waited, as time crawled by with painful slowness, I couldn't stop thinking about Caleb. Where was he right now? Probably at some opulent bistro, toasting with champagne, laughing with Serafina about how simple it had been to dupe me. They were likely already drafting plans about how to spend my wealth, about what to purchase first, about how to carve up the empire they thought was theirs. They had no concept of the hurricane heading their way. They had no idea that the most potent man in the state was about to unleash his full arsenal against them. They had no idea that they had made the fatal error of underestimating a 70-year-old woman who had survived widowhood, isolation, and loss, only to find love again and marry a man who would burn the world down to protect her. 40 minutes later, the processing room door burst open. A man swept in like a gale. He was tall, about 50, in a bespoke navy suit and a leather briefcase that screamed affluence. His dark hair was slicked back. His eyes were razor-sharp, and he moved with the stride of someone who had never lost a verdict. Alistair Sterling, he introduced himself, extending his hand first to me and then to Silas. I am Mrs. Thorne's attorney, and we are departing immediately. Behind him entered 2 paralegals carrying stacks of files, everything necessary to begin dismantling the lie Caleb had built, and behind them, finally, entered Magnus. My Magnus, he looked exactly as I remembered him, but there was something different in his gaze, an intensity I had never seen, a controlled fury that made the air around him vibrate. He was 65, but in that moment he looked like a titan ready for war. Our eyes locked across the room. He crossed the space between us in 3 long strides, knelt in front of me, uncaring that his Italian suit touched the grime of the floor, and took my handcuffed hands in his. "My love," he whispered, and his voice was fractured. "Forgive me for not being here when you needed me." "You're here now," I said, tears running freely. "That's all that matters." Magnus stood up and turned to Alistair. "I want those cuffs off her now. I want every document audited. I want every irregularity exposed. And I want the name of every person involved in this conspiracy against my wife." Alistair smiled. It was the smile of a shark sensing blood in the water. "We are already on it, Mr. Blackwood. I guarantee that by this time tomorrow, Mrs. Thorne will be exonerated and the conspirators will be answering some very uncomfortable questions." Magnus looked at Silas, who had stood up and was standing next to his desk watching everything with absolute astonishment. "Mr. Vance," Magnus said, walking toward him, "my wife told me you made this call possible, that you risked your badge to help her. I want you to know that will not be forgotten." Silas swallowed. She needed help. "That's all. You did more than help. You gave her hope when she had none, and I always settle my debts." Magnus took out his phone and dialed a number. "Enrique, it's me. I need you to prep the property in Silver Lake Estates." "Yes, the 4-bedroom with the acreage. It's going to be for the Vance family. I want the deed ready by morning and ensure it is fully furnished and turnkey." Silas staggered. He had to grip the desk to keep from buckling. "Mr. Blackwood, I can't. That's too much." "It's not enough," Magnus interrupted him, "but it's a start." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of legal activity that I could barely track. Alistair Sterling worked like a machine, dissecting every document in the case, finding discrepancies that my previous public defender hadn't even looked for. It turned out Caleb had made mistakes, small ones but fatal. Dates that didn't align, signatures that were slightly off, testimonies with holes that no one had probed because everyone assumed a son would never crucify his mother. Magnus took me out of that processing room that same night, not directly home. That would have been impossible with the judicial order still in limbo, but to house arrest at one of his private retreats while the emergency appeal was processed. The safe house was a manor on the outskirts, surrounded by manicured grounds and a high wall that guaranteed privacy. There was security at every perimeter, men in dark suits and earpieces guarding every gate. Magnus was taking no chances. He explained that once Caleb found out what was happening, he might try anything to stop it, and Magnus wanted to be armed for any eventuality. That first night in the manor, after the lawyers left and we were finally alone, Magnus held me for hours. He didn't speak much. He just held me while I wept out years of pent-up agony. The pain of having been betrayed by my own blood, the pain of having been so blind, so trusting, so foolish. "You are not foolish," Magnus said when I finally voiced those thoughts. "You are a mother who loved her child. There is nothing foolish about that. I loved him," I whispered against his chest. "God help me. I still love him, and that kills me. I know." Magnus pulled back to look into my eyes. "And that's why we are going to do this the right way. Not for revenge, although God knows it's deserved, but for justice, for the truth, so everyone knows you did nothing wrong." The next morning, Alistair arrived with a breakthrough. He had found a loose thread. One of the witnesses who had testified against me, an accountant who had supposedly audited my finances, was willing to flip. It turned out Caleb hadn't paid him the full bribe. And now the accountant was furious and terrified of going down with the ship. His name was Jasper Reed, a jittery man in his 40s who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Alistair brought him to the manor that afternoon, accompanied by a notary and recording equipment. We were going to document every syllable. Jasper could barely meet my gaze as he sat in the library that Magnus had converted into a command center. "Mrs. Thorne," Jasper began, his voice shaking. "I didn't know it would go this far. You have to believe me. When Caleb hired me, he told me he just needed some documents reviewed, some numbers adjusted for a tax loophole. He paid me 5,000 up front and promised another 20,000 when the verdict was read. And what exactly did you do? Alistair asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. I fabricated financial reports. I created transactions that never existed. I made it look like Mrs. Thorne had been siphoning large sums from joint accounts into personal shells, but none of that was real. It was all mocked up on my server. And the withdrawals I supposedly made, I asked, feeling bile rise. The 150,000 the prosecutor said I stole, they never existed, Jasper admitted, tears leaking now. Caleb gave me access to defunct accounts. I altered the metadata to show recent activity. I changed dates. I invented transaction IDs. Anyone with forensic accounting skills would have spotted the fraud in minutes. But your lawyer never requested an independent audit, because I couldn't afford it, I said bitterly. Caleb froze my assets so fast I could barely pay the retainer. Alistair was furiously taking notes. Magnus, who had been listening from the shadows, finally spoke. Was Seraphina involved? Caleb's wife, Jasper nodded vigorously. She was the one who initially contacted me. Caleb didn't even know my name at first. Seraphina had been planning this for months, maybe years. She showed me the blueprints. She explained exactly what she needed. It was her architecture. He just followed her script. That hit me harder than I expected. A part of me had wanted to believe my son was a victim, that Seraphina had poisoned his mind. But hearing that he had actively participated, that he had followed her orders so willingly, was a direct stab to the heart. Why are you confessing now? Magnus asked. Why risk it? Because Caleb threatened me, Jasper said, voice breaking. After the trial, when I went to collect the balance, he laughed in my face. He told me I would never see a dime. And then he told me if I talked, he would make sure I was the patsy, that he had documents implicating me as the mastermind who tricked an innocent family. And those documents probably exist, Alistair said. Caleb is smarter than we gave him credit for. He created layers of insulation. But now we have this. Magnus pointed to the camera. We have his confession. We have proof of conspiracy. And with this, we can start tearing down their castle. Jasper's deposition was just the first domino. Over the next few days, Alistair and his team tracked every move Caleb and Seraphina had made in the last 6 months. They discovered new bank accounts opened right after my arrest, large transfers scheduled to execute the day after I was imprisoned. They had even already contacted a broker to list my estate. My home, the place where I had raised Caleb, where his father had died, where every corner held a memory, and they were going to liquidate it without a second thought. But what shattered me the most was what we discovered a week after my release. It turned out Caleb had a son from a previous relationship he had kept secret, an 8-year-old boy named Leo who lived with his mother in another city, and Seraphina, in her infinite cruelty, had been feeding that child poison about me. She had told Leo that his grandmother was a criminal, a thief, a wicked woman who had tried to steal his dad's money, that because of me, his dad couldn't send them support. We discovered this when Leo's mother, a woman named Elena Cross, contacted us directly. She had seen the news because, yes, by this point the press had picked up the scent. Magnus Blackwood's wife, unjustly jailed by her own son, was the kind of headline that sold papers. Elena came to see us, bringing Leo. He was a beautiful boy with Caleb's eyes, but with a sweetness that my son had lost long ago. When he saw me, Leo hid behind his mother, terrified. "I'm so sorry," Elena said, weeping. "I didn't know Seraphina was feeding him those lies. Caleb barely visits, and when he does, she's always there, controlling the narrative. I thought she was just being protective, but now I see she was manipulating everything." I knelt in front of Leo, keeping my distance. "Hello, Leo. My name is Victoria. I'm your grandmother. I know they told you bad things about me, but none of that is true. I would never hurt your dad. I love him even now." Leo looked at me with big innocent eyes. "You're not a witch." "No, honey, I'm not." "Then why does Dad say you are?" I didn't have an answer. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his father is a liar, that his father conspired to cage his own mother for greed? I couldn't. I wasn't going to destroy his image of Caleb. Sometimes adults make mistakes, I finally said. Big mistakes, and your dad made a very big one. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love you. Okay, Leo nodded, unsure but less afraid. Alina squeezed my shoulder. Caleb never told me you were kind, she said. He never talked about you at all. Now I understand why. That night I sat with Magnus in the garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violet and gold. You have a grandson, Magnus said softly. A grandson you didn't know existed. Caleb hid him from me for years, I replied, feeling the betrayal deepen. I have a grandson, and he decided I didn't deserve to know him. The kind of person who sends his mother to prison, Magnus said, taking my hand. But now you know him, and if Alina agrees, you can be part of his life. After we finish this, I said, hardening. After Caleb and Serafina pay, then I can be a grandmother. Magnus smiled, a cold, predatory smile. Speaking of that, Alistair has news. The prosecutor reviewed the evidence. They are dropping all charges against you tomorrow in a special hearing, and they are issuing warrants for Caleb, Serafina, and Jasper for conspiracy, fraud, and perjury. I gasped. Tomorrow, Magnus confirmed, but there's a twist. It turns out Caleb organized a gala for tomorrow night, a celebration at the Onyx Club. He invited investors, socialites, partners. He was going to officially announce that he had secured the family fortune, that he was launching a new venture. Basically, he was going to celebrate his victory over you in front of the elite. The irony was perfect. What are you thinking? I asked, seeing the glint in Magnus's eye. I'm thinking, he said slowly, that it would be a shame if he missed his own party. The hearing the next day was quick and vindicating. Judge Abernathy, looking visibly ashamed, reviewed the new evidence. Jasper's confession, the forensic reports, the holes in the testimonies. The prosecutor stood up and formally declared the state was dropping all charges, citing a gross miscarriage of justice. Mrs. Thorne, Judge Abernathy said, on behalf of this court, I offer my sincerest apologies. What was done to you is inexcusable. I nodded, weeping tears of relief, justice, vindication. Arrest warrants are issued for Caleb Thorne, Serafina Thorne, and Jasper Reed, the judge declared. Officers are authorized to proceed. Magnus squeezed my hand. We had won the battle, now for the war. We left the court surrounded by press, but I said nothing. Not yet. Back at the manor, Magnus led me to the master's suite. He had bought me a wardrobe fit for a queen. Rest, he told me. You have to be ready for tonight. Caleb's gala, the moment he planned to gloat. He had no idea warrants were signed. He had no idea his world was about to implode. Magnus had arranged for the arrests to happen after the event started. He wanted Caleb to taste the victory before the fall. I bathed, dressed in a deep burgundy gown, sophisticated and regal. I applied makeup to hide the stress. When I looked in the mirror, I saw Victoria Thorne, not the victim. The survivor, the wife of Magnus Blackwood. Magnus entered looking sharp. You are stunning, he said. I feel like a warrior, I admitted. That is exactly what you are. The Onyx Club was exclusive. Naturally, Magnus was a founding member. We arrived as the party peaked. Valet's champagne laughter. We watched from the shadows of the limo. Are you sure? Magnus asked. We can leave. Let the police handle it. I need to do this, I said. I need him to see me. Magnus nodded. He checked his phone. Alistair is inside. Caleb is holding court. Serafina is wearing a dress that cost a fortune, your fortune. And he just announced his new firm. He's recruiting investors with money he doesn't have. It's time, I said. We walked to the entrance. The valet recognized Magnus instantly. Mr. Blackwood. We didn't know. Surprise, Magnus said tightly. We entered the ballroom. The opulence was nauseating, and there in the center was Caleb, wearing a new suit, holding court, Serafina glued to his side in a garish red dress. They looked triumphant. We stood at the entrance. People noticed. Whispers spread. Robert Sterling and that woman, isn't she in jail? The murmurs grew until the room fell silent. Caleb felt the shift. He turned. His eyes met mine. The color drained from his face, the glass slipped from his fingers. Serafina saw me and looked horrified. I was a ghost who was supposed to be buried. We walked toward them, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. We stopped in front of them. The silence was absolute. "Hello, Caleb," I said, voice calm. "Lovely party. Shame it won't end how you planned." "Mom," he stammered, "you're supposed to be in prison." "Yes, I know." "While you spend my money," Serafina tried to bluster. "This is a private event. Leave or we call security." Magnus laughed darkly. "Security? I own 40% of this building. The guards answer to me." Serafina paled. "Who are you?" Caleb demanded. "I am Magnus Blackwood," my husband said, "and I am your mother's husband." The room gasped. Everyone knew the name. "It's not possible," Caleb whispered. "You never said, because you never asked," I cut in. "You stopped being my son long ago." Alistair stepped forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, all charges against Victoria were dropped this morning. Warrants have been issued for your arrest." "That's ridiculous," Caleb shouted. "You have no proof. We have Jasper Reed's video confession," Alistair stated loudly, "and forensic proof of forgery." "He's lying," Serafina screamed. "We also have the bank records," I added. "And the emails selling my house." "And we spoke to Alina," Magnus added, "about how you poisoned Leo against his grandmother." "How could you?" I asked Caleb, tears threatening. "I gave you everything. You were always controlling." Caleb spat, fear turning to rage. "That money was mine by right." "Then you should have asked," Magnus said. Alistair signaled. The doors opened. Police swarmed in. "Caleb Thorne, Serafina Thorne, you are under arrest." Serafina screamed as cuffs were slapped on her. Caleb stood frozen, defeated. As they dragged him away, he looked at me with pure hate. I realized my son was gone. "Goodbye, Caleb," I whispered. The aftermath was a media frenzy, but it wasn't over. 3 days later, Alistair found the deed. "They sold your house," he told us, "transferred it to Serafina using a corrupt notary, then sold it to an accomplice." "Who?" I asked. "Damon Cross, Alina's ex-husband, Leo's father, the man who abandoned them." "He's the accomplice?" Magnus asked. "He's been bankrolling Serafina. They're lovers. They plan to flee to the Maldives tomorrow with the cash." "Not if we stop them," Magnus said. "We tracked them to my house. They were packing. We went there with security. The house was stripped, everything valuable gone. We found them in the kitchen, Serafina and Damon." "Hello, Serafina," I said. She dropped a box of my jewelry. "How did you get in my house?" I said, "and we froze your accounts and your tickets to the Maldives." She panicked. "You can't prove." "We have recordings," Magnus said, and the notary confessed. Sirens wailed. Police entered. Damon and Serafina were arrested for money laundering and conspiracy. "Ethan hated you," Serafina spat as she was hauled away. "I know," I said. 6 months later, my house is restored. Magnus hired the best artisans. I stood in the garden. Leo was running through the flowers. Alina sat nearby, smiling. Damon was serving 15 years. Serafina got 12. Caleb got 8. I tried to visit Caleb once. He was bitter, blamed me. "I have forgiven you," I told him through the glass. "For me, not for you," and I left. Now in the garden, Magnus handed me lemonade. "Grandma, look," Leo showed me a ladybug. "Let it go, sweetie," I said. "Let it be free." I looked at my chosen family. Magnus, Alina, Leo, and Silas, who now lived in a beautiful estate in Silver Lake, his family secure. I realized then that blood isn't family. Loyalty is. I am 70. I have survived and I have found happiness, because we are never too old to fight for what is ours, and we are never invisible. This is my story, and it has a happy ending. Not because it was perfect, but because I finally learned I deserve to be happy.